Hello, Dylan William here. Sorry I can't be with you. I hope this pre-recorded presentation is nearly as good and there will be a chance to ask questions later. So in this presentation, I want to explain to you why I think assessment for learning is more than formative assessment, and the fact that people have treated those two terms interchangeably has led to a lack of clarity about what formative assessment is and isn't, when it works and when it doesn't. So the outline of the talk, I'm going to spend some time talking about what is assessment, because I think it's important to be clear at the outset of what we mean by assessment. And then I'm going to share with you 5 different perspectives on formative assessment that will help you think about formative assessment in different ways, so you can see how it relates to different aspects of education, which I think helps us implement formative assessment more effectively. So let's start with what is assessment. And I think the clearest definition is based on an idea from Lee Cronbach in a chapter he wrote for the book Educational Measurement in 1971. The idea is that an assessment is simply a procedure for making conclusions, for drawing conclusions, for making inferences in the assessment jargon. We give students things to do, we look at what they do, we draw conclusions. The key question then is, once you know the assessment outcome, once you see what students do, what do you know? What can you conclude? And so, for any assessment procedure, some conclusions are warranted and some are not. And so the big idea here is an assessment is a procedure for drawing conclusions. Whether those conclusions are valid or not is the key issue in assessment. We used to think that validity was a property of a test. The idea was there was a test that might be valid and another test that might be less valid. But if I have a test of mathematics that has a high reading demand, then if I give it to students who are good at reading, then the differences in their scores will reflect their differences in mathematics. But if I give it to students who are much more mixed in their reading abilities, some of them are good readers, some of them are less good readers, some of the variation in scores is caused by how good they are at their mathematics, and some of it is caused by how good they are at reading. So the same test can support valid conclusions about mathematics achievement, for example, for some students and not others. So validity cannot be a property of a test. There's no point in asking, is this a valid test? The correct response is, for what purpose? So the basic idea here, the basic, I think, clarifying idea, is that validity is a property of the conclusions that we draw on test results, not the test itself. As Lee Cronbach said, one validates not a test, but an interpretation of data arising from a specified procedure. So, if an assessment is a procedure for drawing conclusions, there is no such thing as a valid assessment. The big idea here is it valid for some purposes, not for others. Tell me what you want to conclude about a student when you see how they do on the assessment, and I will tell you that that is warranted or not. So let's turn now to formative assessment, because I think this is a really powerful way of clarifying what we mean by assessment in general and formative assessment in particular. And we'll start with a cross-cultural perspective. So I want to share with you a result from the Program for International Student Assessment, the PISA program, and I'm focusing on the results from 2015, where the focus was on science. And one of the things they did was to look at the 75 countries that participated in PISA and asked, basically looking at the data, what factors about a classroom are most consistently associated with high student achievement in science? And if you ask people, they might say the school socioeconomic profile, turns out that's not very important. People might think it's the language of instruction. No, that's not important. The amount of inquiry-based instruction is actually a negative. The amount of teacher-directed instruction is a positive, but even more positive is the extent to which teachers adjust their teaching on the basis of evidence from their class about the sense that students are making of the teaching, what they call the index of adaptive instruction. So just to summarize the results, the top result, the most strongly correlated, was student socioeconomic status. But after that, it was this index of adaptive instruction that had the second strongest impact on student achievement. Now, I'm not saying this is a causal effect, because it could be that teachers are able to use adaptive teaching when they have highly motivated students. But I think it's quite interesting that across the 75 countries that participated in PISA, this index of adaptive instruction was consistently associated with high student achievement. So what do we mean by formative assessment? Well, I think the best way to think about it is just on a very intuitive basis. So, there's a principle about learning and an uncomfortable fact about the world that I think is at the heart of effective formative assessment. The principle comes from the work of David Ausubel, an educational psychologist, who over 50 years ago now said, if I had to reduce all of educational psychology to just one principle, I would say this: the most important single factor influencing learning is what the learner already knows. Ascertain this and teach accordingly. In other words, our teaching should start from where the students are. Obvious, isn't it? Why is it so hard to do that? Because of the uncomfortable fact about the world. Our students do not necessarily learn what we teach. This is our guilty secret as teachers. We teach these wonderful lessons, we take in the students' work, and we wonder what planet they were on when we were teaching this stuff. How could you possibly believe that's what I said? We fail all the time because teaching is really, really hard. We fail because we want every student to succeed, and sometimes they don't. And so the big idea here is that assessment is the bridge between teaching and learning. It is only by assessing that we can figure out whether what we just did as teachers have produced the intended changes in students' thinking. The big idea here is assessment is at the heart of the interaction between student and teacher. Now, some people say, I don't want to use the word assessment for this. It's just good teaching. And of course it is. But just something as simple as checking for understanding is, in my view, an assessment process. We are collecting evidence and we are drawing conclusions. And I think it's helpful to regard that checking for understanding that a teacher does with a class in the middle of a lesson is just as much an assessment as an examination at the end of the year. So, before we go any further, it's useful to distinguish between learning and performance. These are two words that are used by psychologists to describe different things, and it's important to understand the difference. So learning is a relatively permanent change, a long-term change in what students can do, and performance is just the temporary fluctuations in what students can do as a result of engaging in some instructional activity. The point is that they're different. The earliest research in the 1920s looked at rats running mazes, and they discovered that often you would find that a rat was learning something about the maze, even though there was no evidence about that until, for example, some food was placed in a particular place in the maze. So the rats were learning, but they weren't showing it. So we could have learning without performance. More recently, the opposite has been shown. You can actually have improvements of performance that fail to yield significant learning. And certain manipulations can have opposite effects on learning and performance. In other words, some things that make the student's performance in the learning task a bit less smooth can result in better learning. And every teacher knows this. Every teacher knows the experience of teaching a lesson and thinking it's going wonderfully and checking for understanding at the end of the lesson. Everybody's got it, you're very happy, and 2 weeks later, it's as if the men in black have come along with their neuralizers and erased every trace of that lesson. We can have a successful lesson that doesn't result in any long-term learning. And that's why this distinction between learning and performance is so important. As teachers, we are interested in learning. But what we can measure in the lesson is performance. And we can't do much about that, but we have to just be aware that the fact that the students could do it at the end of the lesson does not mean they can do it 3 weeks later. It's the design of the lesson that makes that learning stick. So what I'm suggesting, if we embrace formative assessment, this intuitive idea of finding out what learners are learning before we actually make a decision about what to do next, there are 3 key shifts we need to make. And so the first is from a focus on task performance to a focus on learning. I think that should be quite clear. We need to be focusing on the long term. The second is how we think about aptitude. So typically, when we think about students' aptitude for particular subjects, like mathematics, for example, we tend to say it's about how much of what they've experienced in classrooms they remember, the proportion and complexity of taught material is actually remembered. John Carroll, in the 1960s, pointed out there's another way to think about aptitude. It's just the time taken to learn the material. So there's no such thing as a limited potential. It's just that some students learn more slowly than others, and if they're given more time and more opportunities, they will learn. And there's recent research that shows that actually that's true. There's an extraordinary consistency in how much students learn from particular exposures to instructional materials. Some students need more exposures, but the idea is there's no ceiling on what any student can achieve apart from running out of time. So thinking about aptitude not as potential or talent or intelligence, but just the time needed to become good at something. And then the third key shift is a shift in how we think about teaching from a linear process, where we teach things in a sequence, to a contingent process. In other words, we stop and find out what the students learned before we decide what to do next. And Benjamin Bloom, building on John Carroll's work in the late 1960s, pointed out that if our educational efforts result in a normal distribution of achievement, a bell curve, we are not doing our job properly. He said, a normal distribution of achievement is a sign of educational failure, because the bell curve, the normal distribution, is what nature gives us. If we treat all students the same, we will get the bell curve, because students differ in their ability to make sense on the first hearing of the teaching that they've received. Our job as teachers is to destroy the bell curve, to give the students who need more time, to make sure they get that more time. Another way to think about it is just building plan B into plan A. There's a strange paradox at the heart of teaching. Every teacher I've ever met knows that no lesson plan survives the first contact with children. And yet, most teachers plan their lessons as if they're going to go perfectly. So what I'm suggesting is we build plan B into plan A. We build our lessons with checkpoints into them. And so at a certain point in the lesson, we check to see if the students are with us. And if they are, we move on. And if they're not, we do something different. But the important point is that's part of the lesson plan. And of course, it shouldn't need saying, but it does. When we check on student understanding, it's not just by getting a response from 1 or 2 students, it's by getting a response from every student. I'll say more about that in a minute. So that's the intuitive idea of formative assessment, just this idea of making sense of students' responses to make better decisions. Some people prefer the term assessment for learning, and as I said earlier, I think that's unhelpful, because I think that assessment for learning is a much broader idea than formative assessment. And so I want to just clarify exactly why assessment for learning is not the same as formative assessment. So I'm going to suggest an inclusive definition of formative assessment. I'm going to say that an assessment functions formatively to the extent that evidence about student achievement is elicited, interpreted, and used by teachers, learners, or their peers to make decisions about future instruction, next steps, if you like, that are likely to be better or better founded than the decisions they would have taken in the absence of that evidence. So the big idea here is that an assessment is formative because of the job that it does. There's no such thing as a formative assessment. It's whether it's functioning in a formative way. So, some key points about formative assessment. What makes an assessment formative is not the nature of the assessment or when it happens. It's how the evidence generated is actually used to improve learning. So there's no such thing as a formative assessment. There's only an assessment that is used formatively. The evidence can be used by teachers, or by learners themselves, or by peers. So, self-assessment and peer assessment are part of formative assessment. The teacher isn't the only person in the classroom helping to keep learning on track. The focus is on decisions, not intentions or outcomes. So if a teacher intends to use the evidence, but they don't, I would not call that formative, because the assessment has not formed the direction of future learning. The focus has to be on decisions, not intentions or outcomes. And then the focus is on evidence, not change. So some people say an assessment is formative if it changes what the teacher does. But sometimes all it does is tell the teacher what you are planning to do is the right thing to do. Formative assessment might just confirm rather than change a decision. So those points I think are important clarifications here. No such thing as a formative assessment. Includes self and peer assessment. It's about the use of the evidence, and it might just be confirming that the decision is the right thing to do. The big idea here is if we have better evidence about what's going on in our students' heads, we will make better decisions about what to do next that result in better learning. Now, as I said, some people prefer the term assessment for learning, and so we have this idea of assessment of learning and assessment for learning. And when assessment for learning was first put forward as a term, the definitions, particularly in Canada and in Australia, focused on the role of the teacher. And that was also pretty much true about the UK as well. And so people realized that we needed to bring the student into this, and so people talked about assessment as learning. Now, I think that's not helpful, because I'm very happy that students learn something in doing an assessment, but an assessment is a procedure for drawing conclusions. Learning is a change in what students can do in the long term, and they're not the same thing. So I think that this idea of assessment as learning doesn't actually clarify things. The important thing for me is that formative assessment has always included the role of the teacher, the learner, and their peers. So we don't need the term assessment as learning. But to understand why formative assessment is not the same as assessment for learning, it's really useful to look at how memory works. So in a quite nicely designed study, some students were given a passage to read between 250 and 300 words long. They were given one or two passages at random. Each contained about 30 ID units, and they were all given 5 minutes to read the passage. They then did 2 minutes of maths problems to clear their minds, and then students were randomly allocated to different follow-ups. So 60 students got 3 more 5-minute reading periods interspersed with 2-minute periods of doing mathematics. 60 students got 2 more 5-minute reading periods and 1 10-minute period of being tested. Just write down everything you can remember about what was in the passage. And 60 students, after the first 5-minute read, didn't get to read it again. They were just tested for 3 10-minute periods. Half the students were tested immediately on their recall of their passage, and half the students were tested a week later. You won't be surprised that those who read the passage for 20 minutes did best of all on the immediate post-test. But if they were tested a week later, what is surprising to most people is that those who read the passage for just 5 minutes and spent 30 minutes just trying to remember what was in the passage did best of all. I used to joke that when talking about assessment, weighing the pig doesn't fatten it. That's true in agriculture. It's not true in psychology. Testing students on what they've been learning makes that learning stickier. Why? Well, it's to do with how our memories actually work. So many people think of the way our memory works in the way that Thorndike did back in 1921. The idea is that when you use things, you keep them, and when you don't use them, you forget them. So basically, if you used to know something that you can't remember anymore, the idea is been washed away, like footprints in the sand washed away by the tide. But it turns out that that's not true. It turns out that if you've ever learned something, that memory is never gone completely. What's hard is retrieving it. And that's what Robert Bjork has proposed in his new theory of disuse. So anything in our memories has two characteristics. One is how well it's been learned. That's called storage strength, and that goes up and down. No, that can only go up. And retrieval strength is how easy it is to retrieve at a particular time, and that goes up and down. So, storage strength and retrieval strength, how well you've learned it and how easy it is to retrieve, are increased by restudying an item or retrieving it from memory. But here's the really important insight that is essential for effective teaching. Retrieval has a greater impact than restudy. So retrieving things from memory has a bigger impact on long-term learning than rereading it or being reminded of it. And that's why that result in that study I just showed you came about. It's because the students who were retrieving things from memory were actually trying to remember things that they'd read, and that had a bigger impact than just rereading the passage. The other point that's important is that retrieval and restudy increase storage strength more when retrieval strength is low. So the harder it is to retrieve things from memory, the greater the benefit of that retrieval. And retrieval and restudy increase retrieval strength more when storage strength is high. It's something that you have learned well at some point in the past, but is currently something that you find hard to retrieve. So this is why that old advice that teachers have given students for years, which is little and often, is so important. So spreading out your practice of an idea, of a skill, over lots of different study sessions has a bigger impact, because the longer it is since you last did this, the bigger the benefit of doing it again, whether by retrieval or by restudy. So what does this mean? Well, I think this means that assessment for learning, first used by Peter Mittler in 1973, is a broader concept than formative assessment. We can have assessment for motivation. There'll be a test on Friday. That's assessment for learning, because the purpose of announcing the assessment is to get students to prepare for the test. That's assessment for motivation. Assessment for retrieval practice. It turns out that getting students to complete a test improves their learning, even if the test isn't scored, because the students get the retrieval practice. It's also been shown by studies on students in school as well as in college. Janet Metcalf and Brady Butterfield in particular did some experiments with 8th graders, and they asked students to solve some maths problems and then asked them to rate how confident they were that their problems were correct, their solutions were correct. And if they were incorrect, they were corrected, and then a few weeks later they were tested on similar problems. And what is interesting is the ones who were most confident they were correct when they were actually incorrect benefited more from being corrected. This is called the hypercorrection effect. So in other words, being corrected when you're sure you're right and when you're actually wrong is disproportionately beneficial. And that's an important aspect of when assessments are scored. But I would say that an assessment is only formative when it actually influences future actions in the classroom. So here's a summary of that. If I just announce an assessment, I get assessment for motivation. That's a form of assessment for learning. If I actually give the assessment, then students get retrieval practice. That's a form of assessment for learning. If they find out that what they thought was correct is incorrect, that's a form of assessment for learning. It's an instructional corrective. But I would say it's only formative if the evidence is actually used. So, for me, formative assessment is just a small part of assessment for learning. It's the important part, I think. The evidence we have suggests it's the most important part, but it's not, I think, helpful to use the terms formative assessment and assessment for learning interchangeably, because then you end up talking about different things. You might be talking about assessment for motivation or retrieval practice. So the big idea here, in terms of these labels, formative and summative, is they're best thought of as descriptions of the conclusions, the inferences that we make. So where an assessment comes in an instructional sequence does not make it formative or summative. It's what you do with the evidence. And the same assessment can be used both ways. If I test an 8-year-old boy on his number facts from 1 times 1 up to 10 times 10, there's 100 of them, I choose 20 at random, he gets 10 right, I can conclude he knows approximately 50% of his number facts because I chose them at random. That's a summative conclusion. If I notice he's having specific difficulty with the 7 times table, that gives me something to go on, to work with. That's a formative conclusion. So the same assessment outcomes can be used either summatively or formatively. No such thing as a formative assessment. The important point is that any assessment can be used formatively, but some support formative inferences better than others. Let's look at the functional perspective. For some people, formative assessments are formal set pieces, something like any assessment before the big one. Well, that's okay, that's helpful, tells students they're on track, but I think it's not the only thing. So I choose to define formative assessment inclusively in terms of long cycle, medium cycle, and short cycle. So if we test students every 6 to 10 weeks, that's long cycle formative assessment. You can monitor student progress and you can align your curriculum. If we test students or assess students more frequently than that, every 1 to 4 weeks, making sure the students understand what they need to do to be successful, we get what Richard Stiggins calls student-involved assessment. Assessment becomes something that's done with students rather than to them. But the biggest impact comes when we do formative assessment within and between lessons, minute by minute and day by day. Not so much every 6 to 10 weeks, more like every 6 to 10 minutes. And here's a good example. Here's a class of 5 and 6-year-olds. The teacher's written something on the board and asked the children, is this correct? And well, there's one boy at the bottom left there more interested in me than everything else. I just could not get him to turn around. Most of the children think there's a mistake there. There's a few children who think it's right. You think there's a mistake? Tell me what the mistake is. We'll fix it. We'll vote again. So the big idea here is that the teacher is getting lots of evidence about who's understanding it and who's not, so that she can make better decisions about what to do next. She's responding to the students' needs, and she's doing that on the basis of evidence from everybody in the group, not just the confident students who raise their hands all the time. It's a pedagogy of engagement and a pedagogy of responsiveness. This idea can be used right across the educational spectrum. A science teacher in secondary school wrote up this unbalanced chemical equation and asked the students to complete the quantities of the compounds, and when nobody wanted to change anything, she said to the class, is that now correct? And every student had to vote yes or no. Do you see how different that is from asking everyone okay with that? Because now there's no place to hide. If you vote yes and there's a mistake, you've shown the teacher you don't know what you're talking about. But if you vote no, you know there's a real risk the teacher will ask you to come out to the front and fix the mistake. This idea of engagement and responsiveness is at the heart of effective formative assessment. A pedagogical perspective takes us into the strategies that teachers actually use. And I think we can think about where the learner is going, where the learner is right now, how to get the learner there, to think about the role of the teacher, the peer, and the learner. That gives us 5 strategies by grouping the cells together. So the first one is clarifying, sharing, and understanding learning intentions and success criteria, probably the most widely implemented, but often the least well done of all the strategies. So I do think that teachers need to be clear about learning intentions. I don't want teachers walking into a classroom and saying, oh look, some students. What shall I do with them for the next hour? The teacher needs to have clear learning intentions in mind. But there is not much evidence that telling the students at the beginning what those learning intentions are has any impact, because students don't really understand when they're learning, how they're learning. What might be useful is success criteria, giving students concrete strategies for evaluating their own performance. You'll be successful in this lesson if by the end of the lesson you can subtract one 3-digit number from another 3-digit number, regrouping at least once. But the evidence is actually quite thin in primary and secondary schools that spending a lot of time on telling students what the lesson is all about actually has much impact. It's not a bad thing to do, but I think the important point is we need to be clear about learning intentions and success criteria as having different roles. Learning intentions are for the teacher. They come before you design the lesson. Here's what I want students to get better at as a result of spending some time with me in the classroom. Success criteria are for both students and teachers for evaluating the lesson. This lesson will be a success if by the end every student can subtract one 3-digit number from another 3-digit number, regrouping at least once. It doesn't guarantee they'll learn it, but it does mean that the teacher can make better decisions in the classroom. So just to be clear, learning intentions are descriptions of intended learning. Success criteria are descriptions of task performance. That's why we need both. The second strategy is eliciting evidence. It's all the ways we find out where students are in their learning, not just questioning, but observing. Then providing feedback that moves learners forward. The big idea here is the mistake people often think that is the purpose of feedback is to improve the work the student has handed in. It's not. The purpose of feedback is to improve the learner, to help them do a better job at a similar task at some point in the future. So feedback can either be a medical, here's what you need to do to get better, or it can be a post-mortem, here's what you did wrong. And too often the medical is not very common, and the post-mortem is the standard model. Doesn't matter what kinds of feedback you give, of course. If students have no desire to learn, you're wasting your time. As Richard Stiggins points out, the most important decisions taken in classrooms are not taken by teachers, they're taken by learners. So we have to activate students as learning resources for one another and as owners of their own learning. And in many ways, this last strategy is the most important because it's where all the others lead. I'm often asked to observe classroom practice, and if I watch a lesson, I can pretty much guarantee the first question that teacher will ask me is, how did I do? Nowadays, I say, well, how do you think you did? I'm not avoiding the question. If that teacher can give me a good answer, my work here is done. That teacher knows what she needs to do to improve. She is well on the way to becoming, in the psychological jargon, a self-regulating learner. I think this last strategy, activating students as owners of their own learning, is the most important. It's where all the other strategies lead. So for example, good feedback works towards its own redundancy because it empowers learners to take more responsibility and more control of their own learning. So the idea is that all these strategies work together to empower our students to become more effective in looking after their own learning. Some people prefer the term adaptive teaching or responsive teaching. I don't, because it misses out the learner's role. And the other thing that I think is really clear is you can't even begin to do formative assessment until you yourself are clear about what it is you want your students to learn. So, just to be clear, formative assessment does not tell you what to teach. It does not tell you what it means to understand something. It does not tell you what happens when learning takes place. It does not even tell you how to teach. A commitment to formative assessment is nothing more than a commitment to the idea that the sense our students will make of our teaching is unpredictable, and we will make better decisions about what to do next if we have better evidence about what's going on in our students' heads. A commitment to formative assessment is just this idea that teaching should be a contingent process. don't decide what to do next until you find out how the students have done on what you've already done. It's as simple as that. And the empirical perspective, the research evidence, well, you can look at the reviews of research on feedback and other aspects of formative assessment. There's a lot of evidence there. More importantly, there are direct experiments that show quite big impacts. So Neil Kingston and Brooke Nash reviewed a number of classroom experiments, mostly in secondary schools, finding a 50 to 70% increase in student progress, and a big evaluation in England with 140 high schools, half of them having students taught by teachers who worked on formative assessment, half of them taught by teachers where the school was just given extra cash, found that where the teachers were working on improving their formative assessment practice, there was a 25% increase in student progress over 2 years, over 9th and 10th grades. So that's some pretty direct experiment evidence. Finally, I want to share with you an equity perspective. Some people worry about achievement gaps. I don't think that's the right way to think about it. I want proficiency for all, excellence for many, and all subgroups proportionally represented in the excellent. So every student reaching proficiency, many students getting much higher than that, and whether you're a girl or a boy, whether you come from a wealthy home or a less wealthy home, whether English is your first, second or third language, should have zero impact on your chance of being in the excellent. Some researchers in England were asked to look at, well, what does the evidence say about this? What can we do to make sure that our educational outcomes are more equitable? They looked at the impact on student achievement in the same way that Marzano and Hattie have done, but they then looked at the cost of the intervention, because that's important, and even more importantly, in my view, they looked at the quality of the evidence. And they produced summaries of the research. So the dollar signs show how much the intervention cost, the padlocks show the quality of the evidence, and they estimated how much extra achievement you'd get. And just for completeness, I've got all the slides there. I'm going to pick on the ones that are most cost effective with strong evidence. So there's 7 of them there, but some of them are very much specific to an age range. So let's look at the most cost-effective general interventions with strong evidence. There's 3: metacognition, feedback, and peer tutoring. How does that relate to formative assessment? Well, what was the first one? Self-regulated learning. What was the second one? Feedback. What was the third one? Peer tutoring. So the 3 most cost-effective generic strategies, well supported by research evidence, for closing achievement gaps are 3 of the 5 strategies of formative assessment. What about the other 2? Well, you can't give feedback until you find out what's going on, so you have to elicit evidence. And you don't know what evidence to elicit unless you're clear about the learning intentions. So these 5 strategies form a minimum set of the highest impact strategies for general improvement of educational achievement, and specifically for helping the learners who find learning more difficult, helping them more powerfully, which then closes the range of achievement. So, just to conclude, I want to just put the pieces together now and just remind you of where we started out with. There's a shift in how we think about learning from a focus on performance to a focus on learning. A shift in how we think about aptitude from the proportion and complexity of the material retained to just how much time do they take? How many opportunities do students need to be successful? So then we think about a shift in our teaching, make sure we give those opportunities from a linear process to a contingent process. We shouldn't decide what to do next until we find out what effects our previous teaching had. And there's a final key shift. People talk about data-driven decision-making, and they love that idea of data-driven decision-making. I think that's the wrong focus, because people who focus on data-driven decision-making are obsessed with data. They are drowning in data, but have almost no information because they collected the data without a clear purpose. I think the final key shift is a shift to decision-driven data collection. Before you collect data, decide why you're collecting data. And then, and only then, collect the data and you'll know exactly what to do with it. You can do this 5 minutes before the end of the lesson. A quick check on understanding so that the last 5 minutes could be extension or review. You can do that 3 lessons before the end of a unit. Does the end of the unit need to focus on reviewing the things that they didn't understand, or can you do extension material? You can do it across a semester. You can have an assessment before the end of the semester, so you can use that information both to give you an indication of how students were successful, a summative conclusion, and what you might need to do differently for the last week or two to make the students more successful, a formative conclusion. Thank you.